From ancient loan sharks to international entities, let's talk about banks. Hello everyone, Funky Monkey here, welcome to today's episode. I thought that it would be very appropriate to continue and finish the saga concerning money, seeing how everybody's funds are starting to dwindle with the upcoming winter holidays, with the cost of living, with inflation and all of that jazz, and because last week's episode was around the history of currency. Now, make yourself comfy and let me tell you a story about how banks came to be. But before I do so, let me introduce today's miniature. Although I don't have a track record of selecting very appropriate miniatures that are in sync with the theme of my episodes, I think this time the miniature actually fits. Today I will be painting a bronze dragon wormling and its sea-found treasure chest from WizKids Norzul's marvelous miniature series. As you can see, this little dragon would rather guard its chest instead of putting it in a bank. Now, let me tell you what my plans are for this miniature before we jump in our story. As most times, I will start with a black Abaddon base and come in with ceramite white for zenithal priming. This time I will have the light coming from the left front side of the miniature, so from over my right shoulder. I plan on applying most of the paint on the wormling by dry brushing it on and only adding the small details or making repairs with the usual painting method. Seeing how this is a wormling, I plan on painting the contents of its treasure chest in vivid colors, while making the actual chest of solid dark wood stained with verdigris or copper oxide. Okay, now that you know the plans for the miniature, let's go through our checklist. I have coffee in my mug, I have fresh tea in my mousse cup, and this time, although I already have coffee, I have fresh espresso because, well, espresso is amazing and it's one of those days where I think I need a little bit of a pick-me-up. Oh, and before I forget, I also have my lovely assistant gently snoring behind me, while Mango, my other assistant, is sleeping on the opposite side of the room, and from time to time when I get really excited and my voice gets really squeaky or very high, she throws daggers at me because I am waking her up. But do not be afraid. Later on, she will receive treats and she will forgive me. Now, how about you? Are you comfy and snug? Perfect. Then I think it's time for a story. I am sure that you agree with me when I say that banks aren't necessarily the most beloved inventions that humans came up with. And unfortunately, I am sure that most of us at one point or another in our life either dealt with or will deal with banks. And it's almost always a stressful encounter. But let me tell you where they come from and why are banks, well, the way they are. I think that the idea of borrowing stuff from one another has been with humanity since our species' infancy. Even as a prehistoric human, at one point or another you might have needed something in particular, be it food, be it some clothing, be it wolf pelts. If you don't know that reference, check out my previous video, link is right over there. You might have even needed a place next to a fire to warm yourself. You might have needed some resources or in general some goods. Now, perhaps you as a prehistoric human, you weren't borrowing something for the first time and you wanted to ensure that you get to loan whatever you needed. Or perhaps you already borrowed something but you weren't able to repay it in full, or the person or the community you were trying to borrow something from didn't have that particular thing in excess. They would part with that particular thing, but not that easily. So, you try to sweeten the deal. You promise to return whatever it is that they loaned and throw something extra on the side just to make sure that they meet you halfway. This, I am sure, sounds really familiar. We do this since we are children. It's in our nature. We barter for things we want or we need, and in return we promise, or straight out give something that we don't need, we don't like, or we have more of. Or we can even barter for favors. Give me this and I'll owe you one. We do this with our parents, we do this with our siblings, we do this with our friends or even fresh acquaintances. We even promise something very obscure in return. I remember when I was younger and going to the seaside, there were people who were asking to borrow a beer and give you an empty bottle in return, as if you would need it. Or, better yet, they would wish you good luck, or they would redirect karma your way. Again, this is in our nature. Who hasn't bartered for a toy, for a sticker as a kid, for a pencil, for somebody's lunch? Well, because we've all done it, of course, there were people who thought, hang on, I could actually profit off of this. And they started doing it on a larger scale. Now, the first form of banking started in ancient, but really ancient Mesopotamia, in Sumer. This happened around the 22nd century BCE, so around 2100 something, almost 4100 and let's say 50 years, give or take. Loans were initially given out by great temples in cities, and after a while the state realized that it had to get involved. So, around 4000 years ago, the Sumerian state started taking over, giving out loans to citizens. The first money lenders were either very rich private individuals or very rich merchants, who were also private individuals. But I hope you see where this is going. This was not an official profession. There were no official words in any Mesopotamian language for bankers or banks. These concepts did not exist. But what we have here in essence are loan sharks. I won't try to go too much into detail because there's not that much detail to begin with. Most of what we know about the ancient Sumerian loan systems and transactions in general come from deciphered clay tablets, and there aren't many of them, or there aren't many of them that necessarily deal precisely with this topic. What is noteworthy though is that researchers throughout time came to the conclusion that banks couldn't necessarily come into being in a closer form that we could perhaps recognize today. And this is because of a very, very simple problem. Sumerians and ancient Mesopotamians in general did not have coinage. And I'm sure you're wondering what they actually loaned then. They loaned seed grain. They loaned goods, grains, flour, oil, cattle, but mostly seed grain, with repayment upon harvest. Of course, there are many other theories that revolve around why the banking system could not actually work in ancient Sumer, such as the problem with clay tablets being fragile and cumbersome, again, the absence of coins, or even the legal system did not really facilitate such a service. But let me give you my 2 cents, or 2 wolf pelts. Again, previous reference. I truly believe that, as everything else around humanity, the banking system had to evolve. What the ancient Sumerians had was a very basic proto-banking system. You could take out loans for your crops. You were able to take out loans to ensure you had a crop that year, and then you would repay in grain upon harvest. And then you would be able to borrow grain directly from the temple, or flour, or oil so on and so forth. It was a very interesting system. It was working, but it needed to evolve. And evolve it did. Upon reading the Code of Hammurabi, you would be able to see that there were several laws that were passed in regards to deposits, loans, interests, liability, contracts, notaries, etc. And with that, we need to move a little further in history, closer to our time, to ancient Greece, where the next important milestone can be identified. But before we do so, let's take a few moments and talk about this wonderful mini and see how the painting is coming along. I think I found a good way of ruining brushes, dry brushing metallic paints on miniatures. Perhaps the paint was a little too dry in the bottle. Anyway, always remember to wash your brushes after using such paints in this way. After using Agrax Earthshade Nuln Oil to darken the miniature and adding shadows, I am now coming in with Retributor Armor and adding back the mid-tones. As for the highlights, I am using Liberator Gold to catch only the raised details and areas facing the light source. Okay, let's continue. In ancient Greece, we start seeing something more akin to what we would recognize as being a proper banking system. This was because in ancient Greece, they were the first to introduce coinage and circulate coinage. This allowed for money lending to really take off. It was now much easier to lend, to borrow, and to make deposits. Like in ancient Mesopotamia, money lending was done out of great temples. Temples were at the very heart of this service initially. There are multiple reasons for this situation, but among the most important is that people trusted the clergy, they trusted temples. Another reason was that they were very busy. What better place to advertise your business of money lending than in a temple? It gave you gravitas, it gave you more credit before those you wanted to lend money to. Furthermore, the gods were watching. Everything was done within a temple, a sacred place. Promises made here were not that easily broken. The gods watched over the contracts. The most important reason, at least in my opinion, is that temples were always busy. There was always somebody in the temple, and the city guards very often patrolled the temples. This meant that temples were very safe. Additionally, most temples had vaults in their basements, another layer of protection. Priests were also almost always there. This, in my opinion, trumps every other reason I've listed thus far. Now, those who were able to make deposits in temples also did this in multiple temples, because you would always unfortunately run the risk of the temple burning down and you losing all of your money. Also, in the rare cases that a temple would be pillaged or ransacked, you didn't want to lose everything. So the old saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket, I think is really old. Older than we give it credit. In ancient Greece, seeing how the state kinda guaranteed the weight and value of coins, loans were of course easier to access. You knew what you were getting. No longer did you have to go and take a loan in seed grain or any other perishable goods. You are now able to take out money and go purchase whatever it was that you needed. I think it is also important we talk about the interest rate. Upon taking out a loan, the interest rate was 12% annually. This was widespread among the multiple city-states in ancient Greece. But I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that I'm sure it also depended on the quantity of money, the sum that you were borrowing. Of course, Then again, the state was the one who set this interest rate. So it might have been a blanket thing. But anyway, the first Greek moneylenders were called trapezitai or trapezites. Their name derived from the shape of the table they were using while conducting their business. First and foremost, they were money changers. They would take foreign currency and exchange it for local currency, like the places you see around airports or around cities in general. This was done, of course, as it is today, at an interest. They always gained something. They were also pawnbrokers, they were also notaries, they gave out loans, they paid interest, and they were also making sure that the deposits were kept safe. Oh, before I forget, another reason for people depositing their money in temples was because priests would keep very precise track of all the money you had in the deposit, how much you withdrew, how much you added. The books that the priests kept regarding deposits and the money present in their temples was considered to be so precise that it was a very straightforward evidence in case of trials. Now, what I find very interesting is that money changers were almost always part of the metic class in ancient Greece. This means that they were foreigners to the city they were conducting their business in. It means that perhaps somebody from Sparta was conducting their money-changing business in Athens. They weren't a citizen of Athens, they were a foreigner. They didn't have the same rights as a citizen of Athens. This was because this kind of business, money-changing and money loaning, was considered to be very shady, very dirty. You wouldn't see elites involved in such a thing, or even people of great standing in their society and community. There's a whole discussion around how wealth was obtained in ancient Greece, or actually how people thought it was proper to obtain wealth in ancient Greece. But you know the drill, another story for another time. But I'm not gonna leave you hanging, I'm gonna give you a very, very, very short rundown of the story. People believe that wealth obtained through commerce was improperly obtained. They believe that commerce was very prone to corruption. In the opinion of most people in ancient Greece, wealth had to be obtained, if it were to be obtained properly, through military service. Of course, I'm sure that this has to be taken with a pinch of salt because at the end of the day, money was money in ancient Greece. If somebody had enough money to spend, people kind of turned a blind eye to how they made that wealth. But again, I'm gonna go into more detail on another occasion. What's interesting when it comes to wealth and inheritance in ancient Greece is that women were not allowed by law to inherit their husband's wealth or business. As such, there was a very strange practice that was very well established. If a money changer or a proto-banker died, their wife, their widow, would not be able to inherit their business and wealth. As such, usually the wealth would be transferred to or left before death to the most trusted slave of that individual. In order to secure the business, the wealth, to guarantee that deposits were still safe, the widow of the proto-banker would marry the slave. The slave, upon his enslaver's death, would inherit everything, would be, in that case, liberated and inducted into the metic class of foreigners who conducted business in a city. This allowed for the business to stay in the family, and I'm sure this never led to horrifying abuse. But again, everything around humanity has to evolve. This also is true for the role of all humans in society. That being said, the first banker or proto-banker recorded in Greek history was an individual called Philostephanos of Corinth. He was mentioned in the later part of the 5th century BCE, so almost 2500 something years ago. One of the most prominent bankers in Athens history, or very old history, was called Passion. He was the former slave of two business partners who ran a money-changing business. Upon their death, he inherited everything. He was liberated, he was inducted in the metic class, and he was in business in Athens between 394 BCE and 370 BCE. Upon his death, his most trusted slave, Phormio, took over and continued the business. Even Aristotle's father-in-law was actually a money lender or a money changer. Okay, now it's time to jump a little bit forward in time until we reach ancient Rome, the next milestone. But before we do so, if you've reached this far into the video, make sure you hit that like button, make sure you subscribe, and make sure you hit that bell notification so you never miss whenever I put out a new video. This way you will always be up to speed with history trivia that you could easily use to enhance your own homebrewed world, or simply bore the living daylight out of those around you, especially now with the winter holidays upon us, when most of us have to survive family encounters. What better way to avoid talking about politics or the living cost or any other thing than by talking about banking history, or the history of bards, or the history of roads. I have videos on all of that. You can check out my channel right there and pick your poison. Pick the subject you want to use in order to avoid those awkward conversations around the dinner table, or actually enhance the discussion around the dinner table. Oh, and make sure you check out TW Creative-Cats. There are some amazing new shorts that offer a glimpse in the very busy lives of our wonderful, wonderful cats. Don't worry, it has nothing to do with history, and it has everything to do with incredible adventures. Now, let's go take a look at the miniature before we talk about ancient Rome. Earlier I used Elemental Bolt, a turquoise paint from the Army Painter, to add details on the wormling's scales. Now I'm coming in with Waywatcher Green Glaze to shift those details a little more towards green. I am going around the whole miniature, getting all the rings on its scales, all the while making sure I don't get any green on the bronze scales. I know my bronze is a little too on the gold side, but I had to choose between a copper I didn't like and a dark gold, so I made the choice, for better or for worse, going towards golden. Okay, so there's a lot to say about banking and bankers in ancient Rome, so let's get to it. As in ancient Mesopotamia, as in ancient Greece, at the heart of money transactions were the great temples in most of Roman cities. As it happened in Sumer, well, obviously, and as it happened in Greece, deposits left in temples did not generate an interest. They were put there only for safekeeping. In ancient Rome, temples also operated, or some temples also operated as mints. Such an example was the temple of Juno Moneta, while others were only there to safeguard deposits. Such an example was the great temple of Saturn in Rome, where the aurarium or the Roman public treasury was housed. But with time, the system evolved and started resembling something even more closer to what we would identify as a banking system. Besides temples, slowly but surely, private individuals came into the business. These individuals started setting up shops or stalls in forums and slowly became a very vital part of the Roman economic system. There were three kinds of proto-bankers in ancient Rome. The first were called the Argentari. These were private citizens who had shops and stalls in markets, in forums, and sometimes even in temples. They were part of a very small in number and very hard to get in guild. The shops that they used were owned by the state, and their initial job was that of money changers. Of course, occupying a stall that the state owned also kinda, in theory, made them be more honest in their business, at least in theory. Having the state looking over your shoulder, in theory, kinda did that to people. In time, the Argentari evolved to give out loans, to hold deposits, to participate in auctions on behalf of individuals, to identify counterfeit currency, to circulate newly minted coins, making sure that they had as wider spread as possible, and also had a role when it came to selling and buying of property. The Argentari were also involved in bill exchange. They would receive a sum of money and they would issue a receipt called a prescriptio that could be cashed in at another Argentarius in another city. This meant that people didn't have to haul chests filled with money on the road. They could simply have a bill, a prescriptio, and redeem it in another city. This also came in handy because, again, the Argentari were part of a very small, very tight guild. This meant that a prescriptio issued in Rome could easily be identified and authenticated in, let's say, Alexandria in Egypt. These were basically checks. Now, the table they used was called a banco. This is believed to be the origin of the word bank. Oh, and one more thing. I cannot remember the source, so please don't quote me on this fully. It stuck with me from my early years in university. I remember reading at one point that Argentari had a table made out of a particular kind of marble. Whenever they transactioned with money, they would verify the authenticity of coins by bouncing them, by flipping them on the table, and depending on the thickness, on the material, on the weight and the value of that coin, and the sound that it made upon hitting the marble surface, they were able to tell if the coin was actually authentic or counterfeit. I don't really remember where I read this, but it's burned into my memory because it's a very strange and interesting and fascinating little detail. And to be honest, it is very, very easy to integrate this in your TTRPG world, TTRPG campaign. Imagine your players going from one city to another and trying to pay with their coins and having not a dwarf because they would tell if a coin is counterfeit, but they would have a half-elf or a halfling just flip the coin on the table and listen for the clink it made. Oh, also, this is quite interesting because we now see how people realize that it is quite impractical to hold large sums of money and dangerous to a certain degree to move money from one place to another, and as such they came up with easy solutions. Of course, initially this service of redeeming bills was very, very limited because, again, the Argentari were part of a very small guild. But I'm sure that besides the Argentari, there were many other people who tried to get into this business and tried to create something that ran in parallel with the Argentari. Oh, deposits left with the Argentari usually did not yield an interest, but they came up with a system where you, as an individual who deposited money, could risk your money in order to gain a deposit. They would usually take the money you deposited and loan it out for an interest that then they took a part out of, and the rest was your share of the interest. It was a risky business, at least in antiquity, but there were people who made fortunes using this interest-generating deposits. Now, let's go to the state or public bankers, the mensari. The first mensari were recorded in history by name in 312 BCE, 2334 years ago. They were appointed by the state in response to a crisis that the Republic was going through. Constant wars and high interests when it came to loans, and the free reign of loan sharks impoverished the Roman plebs to the point where there were several uprisings, and at one point they simply refused to participate in the official business of the city and refused to participate in the election of consuls, their military and political leaders, basically their executive. The loan sharks were so brutal and divisive in their endeavors that they always valued the properties, valued the goods that people were trying to use as security for loans very low, and if people failed to pay their loans or pay the interest, they would be taken into slavery. One such example was the culmination that sparked a revolt in Rome. Upon the end of a military campaign, the army returned to the city, and one very brave, highly decorated officer was greeted at the gates by debt collectors who wanted to take him as a slave because while he was away on campaign, his household, his family left behind, was not able to repay the loan they took out to survive through winter. This made people stand up to the loan sharks and physically protect the officer, and he, according to Titus Livius, stepped forward and said that this isn't something that he or anybody else deserves, especially because they were away fighting for their citadel, for their city. Because of situations like this, the Roman Senate gave in and named 5 mensari. These individuals, with the authority of the state behind them, went in and started trying to resolve situations. They started by re-evaluating the properties that people used as security for loans. Then they moved on to re-evaluate the debts, re-evaluate the interest rates. They started to re-evaluate the situation of all those who were taken as slaves by loan sharks. After a few months of them being in office, most debts were cleared or resolved. People who were able to guarantee their loans with property or with goods were able to receive funds from the state and repay their debts. There were those who were freed from indentured labor, and there were those who weren't able to guarantee with anything, but their goods or their properties, the little that they had, was used as collateral, and the state took ownership of their houses, of their goods, and repaid their debt. Now, it was better to owe the state than to owe loan sharks. The 5 mensari did such a good job that everybody in the end, or almost everybody in the end, was pretty happy with the results. And although initially named just to solve a crisis, in time the office of the mensari became a permanent institution in the Roman system. In time, because their portfolio was pretty much identical to that of the Argentari, people would most often confuse the two. The mensari would take deposits, they would safeguard the salary, the pay of soldiers, they would determine the authenticity of coins, determine their value, but in the end their role was more on the public debt side. They were state-backed bankers. And the last kind of bankers were the numulari. They were officers of the mint. Their role was to ensure the quality of coins and their value. Much of their activity was identical to that of the argentari and the mensari, but they were usually involved when it came to very large transactions. And their chief objective was to make sure that newly minted coins were up to par and that they made the argentari buy the new latest minted coins and then make sure that those coins were used and spread as far as possible. Again, coins were sometimes the only way people from the far off corners of the empire would see the face of the emperor and knew who the emperor actually was. So their role was pretty important. Again, they also dealt into credits and in loans and deposits, but their chief objective was quality of coins, minting coins, and diffusion of coins. Outside of this, legions also had a banker. Every legion had at least one banker, the aquilifer, the standard bearer, you know, the guy with the aquila. Soldiers were paid a salary, but it was kinda hard to simply hold your purse of coins around. So, soldiers would deposit their money in the legion's deposit. Out of the money they were paid, a lump sum would be held back for provisions, supplies, and equipment and repairs. Some soldiers would make sure they had a deposit made with the aquilifer, the legion, so that upon death a funerary monument would be erected in their honor, or they made sure that the money they accumulated went to their families. Although this is another story for another time, but legionnaires and Roman soldiers in general were not allowed to marry and have children, at least in theory. In practice, it happened all the time. The Roman soldiers would be able to go to the aquilifer and withdraw some cash when they went on leave, if they wanted to purchase something in particular, and the aquilifer would make sure that they kept very, very accurate books. Now, I don't think that the deposits in legions actually came with an interest. I'm most sure they didn't. But I have to check this. Again, it's another story for another time, so I have time to research this. But now it is time we take another break, take a look at the miniature before we talk about the Middle Ages and come closer to our time period before we wrap things up. Now that the sand around the treasure chest is done, I noticed a few pearl necklaces that needed to be painted. For the sand I used Entry Dust, darkened with Agrax Earthshade. I am painting the pearls with Fenrisian Grey because it has that bluish hue that I think works, and also noticed a locket of swords that needed to be painted, and I went with Everland Sunset because I had it on my palette. With the contents of the treasure chest done and the wood painted in, I am coming in with the copper I don't like, Fulgurite copper, and I am painting the metal elements of the chest. Although I don't like this color, it is copper and it oxidizes, especially in the presence of salt water. And it runs, leading to verdigris, staining the wood. It's gonna look awesome. Okay, Middle Ages. There's a lot to say. There's a huge amount of information regarding banking systems and their evolution throughout Middle Ages and up until a few years ago. And the stories come from all over the place. Everybody in every corner of the world came up or emulated or copied banking systems. But I will focus on Europe because, as research shows, this is the place where modern banking came into being. As such, I'm gonna jump around through centuries and jump around all over the place and only give you the highlights. First and foremost, Christians and Muslims forbade giving out loans with interest. They considered it to be a huge sin. Jewish people considered the same thing, but they had a caveat. The exception was that you, as a Jewish person, were allowed to give out loans with interest, but to non-Jewish people. Of course, this was on paper. In practice, please let's be honest and realize that regardless of religion, if you gave out a loan, you would most definitely, at least unofficially, ask for interest. Nobody gives money away without asking something in return. Even if you didn't ask for money, for an interest, most definitely you would ask for favors, you would ask for goods. So let's not kid ourselves and let's not say, oh, this is something the Jewish found as a loophole while the Christians and Muslims were pure and unsullied by sin. No. Okay. In the Middle Ages, in Italy, in Lombardia, merchants and bankers started dealing in cereal crops. They would give out loans based around crops. Because in Spain, in the Middle Ages, there were numerous moments when they had a problem with Jewish people. Around the 11th, 12th century, there were a significant number of Jewish people who were displaced because of this discrimination, and they took refuge in Italy and got on this market. What made them stand out, head and shoulders above the local merchants and bankers, were two things. One, they were able to give out loans with interest because they were trading with non-Jews, but they also started giving out loans against crops and insuring crops. This was very important. They insured the farmers in case of crop failure. They supported, there were loans given out in case of drought, and thus became a pillar of the community. They also having gained some wealth because they were generating interest, they were able to give out high risk, high profit loans. This allowed them to easily outcompete any Italian banker or merchant. Now let's jump to the 13th century, when the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitallers would take local currency, value it, and then issue bills that could be redeemed for the same value in any of their castles or chapters throughout Europe. Now let's take another step in the evolution of banking. Throughout Europe, there were trade fairs during which there were moneylenders who would issue bills that would be redeemable to other moneylenders in other countries during trade fairs. Or, better yet, and this is quite interesting, you could buy a bill that would be redeemable in the future at the fair in the same country, in the same location, but 2 years from now. In order to avoid the sin part, they would be sold with the interest for the next period of time already included, but discounted. Basically, they were doing the same thing that most shops do during Black Friday. They ramp up the prices and then sell you the product at the original price with a bit of profit already included. The only downside of this method was that the bills had a very limited usability. You could use them either at another trade fair in another country or during the same trade fair but in the future. In the 13th century, bankers and merchants from Lombardia and Venice came up with a loophole that allowed them to circumvent the sin part. They would give out loans with no interest whatsoever, but the individual who took out a loan had to insure against disaster. They had to insure against failure or against inability to pay the loan. By the 14th century, the Italian bankers came up with so many loopholes that they were able to outcompete the Jewish bankers and spread throughout Europe, opening branches in many cities, especially around courts. By the 15th century, because the practices of these bankers were not entirely honorable, they were expelled from many countries, or they were simply banned from making a profit, as it happened in England in 1402 under Henry IV, or expelled from cities such as Paris in 1407, or arrested and then expelled as it happened in Flanders in 1403 or 05. In the 16th century, because the Spanish were again against Jewish people, many Jewish people took refuge in the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul, where they started implementing a banking system because, as you remember, officially Muslims could not give out loans with interest. But Jewish people had not the backing of the state, but the state tolerated them and their practices, and as such, interest-based banking system was introduced in the Ottoman Empire. Most bankers in Istanbul were either Jewish or were Greeks, but not Muslims, officially. In the 17th century, we see the use of the first banknotes in Sweden. These banknotes allowed the holder, the bearer, to redeem the value inscribed on the banknote in coins, either of silver or of gold. Then, at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, we have the use of the first fiat money. Basically, banknotes that did not allow the bearer to redeem the equal value inscribed on them in coins. These banknotes were used by the British during the Napoleonic Wars. Then we reach the 20th century, where after the Great Depression, the whole idea of banking changed. Now we have deposits, we have credits, we have insurance, we have money markets, and so on and so forth. And with the evolution of technology, who knows what the future of banking will bring us. But to be honest, I'm sure it won't be cryptocurrency. But I've already touched upon this topic in my previous video, and I'm sure you agree, seeing how FTX went under and how the inability of the state to intervene and guarantee value of money, of goods, and so on and so forth could lead to massive abuse. And to think that everything we've covered today started from grain lenders in ancient Mesopotamia, and now we have state banks, we have private banks, we have private creditors, we even still have loan sharks. Not much has changed, to be honest, besides the legal framework, the technology, and perhaps our view towards banks and this whole system. And with that, thank you so much for the privilege of your time. I truly hope that you found some inspiration and learned something new today. And I cannot wait to see you all here next time on Funky Monkey MP, the place where you get your weekly dose of miniature painting, history, world building, and the necessary tools to survive family encounters by using history trivia. Make sure you leave a comment with your thoughts about this whole topic down below. I'm very curious to hear what your opinion is. And if I missed something, anything. I haven't covered China or India because although they come up with their own banking systems, eventually in the 19th century they adopt and copy the European banking system. But in essence, they follow the same footsteps. Okay, enough. With that, have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful day. Cheers.